Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And without further ado, I shall take the presentation that I've prepared. And just to remind you that this is a session about coming to terms with stroke. And it's with myself. I'm Louise Forrest, the lead counsellor at Bristol After Stroke, and my colleague Dawn Daly, also a counsellor at Bristol After Stroke, who will be available on the call after the presentation to share her thoughts, and maybe both of us might be able to answer any questions that you're hanging on to by the end of the presentation. So just a tiny bit about us first. I wanted to start by saying that neither of us have had a stroke, but we've both been counselling for many years. So that means we know, basically, all people face difficulties in life at some point or other. What we also know is that their response to them is about as unique as they are. And just covering some of the aims I have for today's session, I don't know what you're bringing yourself as your personal aim, but I was thinking that perhaps this is an opportunity for you to reflect on where you're at in your journey. And there might be a possibility of learning something new, either through what I share or some of the questions and answers that are given later. And obviously, as I've already said, a chance to ask a counsellor a question, as you've got both of us on the call with you today. So I'm hoping by the end of today, you'll realise you are not actually alone, but part of a broader life after stroke community. And just before we get into any more content, I wanted to give you a gentle trigger warning that some things that you hear today may trigger unpleasant memories, emotions, or worries. It's not my intention to make you feel uncomfortable. So if this happens, please do look after yourself as best you can, and maybe do something nice for yourself afterwards. Oftentimes, difficult feelings do pass of their own accord if we don't get in the way too much. So let me start by briefly just summarising some of the impacts of a stroke. It is a major life event because it can impact on so many different levels. There are physical changes, of course, not just because it's impacted the brain, but that means it can impact on many individual physical function body. And a stroke can also produce some emotional changes, not just because it's a shocking event, but also depending on the regions of the brain that are affected, you might find that you are somewhat emotionally different to how you were and how you managed life before. On top of that, we see behavioural changes because the adaptation to physical changes and maybe emotional changes too that I've already mentioned mean that people's behaviour change. There's a lot of adaptation that needs to take place. And as well as all of that, there can be for some people communication challenges and difficulties, a phasing of that. And if that wasn't enough, then naturally all of these things can contribute to relationship changes or challenges in the future because your needs have changed. So those are some of the things that people may have experienced already. And I wanted to start by helping you to think a little bit about what supports you in general to meet change. So when I was thinking about this, I was reflecting on the fact that change is happening all of the time. Oftentimes it's very gradual change, and therefore it creeps in without us really noticing and stopping to sit down and think about it. And whilst gradual change is rarely noticed, sudden change really does demand our attention, and you need time after such things to update your self-concept. This is certainly true after a stroke because of the major changes I've mentioned on the previous slide. So what do I mean when I say self-concept? It might be somewhat similar to what people consider as their identity. It's really the sort of thing that you might be answering if somebody asked you the question, or you stop to pause and ask yourself the question, who am I? What is it that makes me who I am? So self-concept and identity are not an external thing that someone else could look at and experience in the same way. It's not like pointing to a chair or a table where you might be able to agree on what that looks like and how to use it. Who you are is a lot more elusive. And who we are is changed, nevertheless, by life events. Life events of any kind do change us. That's whether we like it or not. And as I've said before, this could be gradual change or more often sudden change if we have a big life event. So this is something to reflect on from time to time. And I wonder if you are able to consider whether you are accepting or resisting the change that's happened to you, and what it would be that was in your awareness that would allow you to think, oh, okay, yeah, actually, I'm not accepting that. That's a symptom that I'm probably more likely in resistance. So I think we'll come back to that later on. I also wanted to make it a note that change is stressful. It's stressful for most people, and if those changes that I've mentioned following a stroke aren't difficult enough, then there is a stress life event scale that was produced by some researchers called Holmes and Rahe. It's called the Life Stress Inventory. And they ranked a number of life events in terms of how difficult it was for people in general to orient to them and cope with them. When I looked at this again, I realised that in the top 12 most stressful events, there are these three. This one, the top one there, I've got marked out as personal injury or illness. Inevitably, that is encompassed by having a stroke. Another one is retirement from work, and I think when they were listing this, what they meant was a natural retirement or an expected retirement in normal circumstances. So I've listed here in relation to the fact that a lot of people who've had a stroke may not have been retired, so they may be off work. It's a forced change for them, and they may be with the uncertainty of whether or not they'll be able to go back. Inevitably, quite a stressful thing to be with. And the other thing I've marked off here is a major change in health or behaviour of a family member was also in their top 12 most stressful life events. So I say that to help to demonstrate really what a big thing it is to have a stroke, to have a family member who's had a stroke, and for you to be all facing some level of change and adaptation, possibly without knowing how long those things will last, whether they're temporary or permanent. So this had me reflecting on what can help someone to face change. And I wondered if we looked at our relationship to change. Each one of us will have an individual relationship to change and how well we embrace it or accept it. And I wondered if you'd engage in a thought experiment with me to just think about something in your life before the stroke that was a change that you chose. Sorts of things that I'm thinking about might be, a job, accepting a new job, making a choice about education, perhaps starting a new relationship, deepening a relationship, moving house, but a change, whether that's large or small, that you chose. And if you've got something in mind, I just wanted you to also think about whether you can remember what helped you to adjust. I don't doubt if it was a significant change, there was some adjustment to do. And there may well have been things you did for yourself or just happened that were really supportive of that change. And another question, how long did it take you to adapt or accept? I personally believe it's quite easy to forget when we're choosing change, that actually still takes a level of energy to adapt. Thinking for myself, you know, a job change can change all sorts of routine, patterns, and those sorts of things do take time. And if that was thinking about change that we'd actually chosen in our lives, how much more difficult is it to accept a change that's not been chosen, something like a stroke? So again, when I was reflecting on this, I was thinking how appropriate it might be to draw a parallel with grief and loss. And if you've had a bereavement, you might be able to recall how long it took to adjust to losing somebody. And for some people, the pain of losing somebody never actually goes away, but over time they get used to bearing it a little bit more, or a little bit more easily. Grief is a very unique process, and I'm sure that's true also if we look at the parallel with stroke and the sense of losing yourself or your old self and needing to come to terms with a new self. So with that in mind, I thought it was worth just showing this slide, which is an encapsulation of something about the grief cycle. It goes from normal functioning on the left side of the slide through to returning to a meaningful life. And that can go, if somebody makes that full journey, it can go through a number of stages and loops and sometimes feel like you're looping back on yourself or stuck in a phase or a stage for a long, long length of time. But just naming some of those stages that are common, not inevitable, I must say, but are common to people. There's often something in the first stage around shock and denial. And that could involve a level of confusion or numbness, disbelief that it's happened to you. For example, the stroke has actually happened, and a denial on some level that it's going to affect you in any way. Maybe if you come out of that stage and meet something else, there may be a stage or a phase which is much more energized, and this could be the anger and frustration stage, and maybe also a heightened energy state, which is anxiety. It often goes alongside that type of stage. Frustration that it's happened, frustration that you can't do what you used to be able to do. And maybe that might also be accompanied with some embarrassment or shame. The bottom of the loop, as it's shown in the diagram there, is about the depression and detachment stage. This could be symbolized by being overwhelmed and having very little energy, determination to try anything, to get up, to do your rehab. A level of helplessness or hopelessness may set in, and you might have thoughts about, like, what's the point? And coming out sort of out the other side, if that's the low point, there can be a dialoguing or maybe even a bargaining stage. This can often be a stage or phase where you're reaching out to other people. There's a desire to tell your story, to be able to perhaps hear yourself and make sense of it. The more you tell your story, the more you might hear different bits in it. You might get different people's reactions and start to adjust in some way to that. And finally, there may be glimpses of acceptance along the way. You might start to explore more options about living with things, your new self, the way it is. You might empower yourself in the ways that you can whilst accepting things you can't, and you might regain a sense of meaning or purpose in your life. So having said all of those things, I think it's also worth saying that we can't choose our feelings. So anyone going through that process and grief or stroke recovery is not necessarily a linear process. It's important to realise that you can't always choose how you feel. Of course, they're not emojis that you click on and change. And inevitably, most people find it easy to accept the feel-good feelings when we have them. But after a stroke, there may be much harder ones to feel, and those being very uncomfortable are difficult to bear. Now, our Action After Stroke course helps people to understand that we can't choose feelings, and it does allow people to realise there are other ways to be with them. And one of the things that we do in the Action After Stroke course is talk about mindfulness as a way of being with things. So more about that later. The other thing, feelings lead me to think about moods, and putting a mask on our moods doesn't help either. It can be a very natural thing to do, whether that's disguising our true feelings from a loved one, maybe from professional staff that we're working with in terms of rehab, or anyone else for that matter. One of the risks is that if we hide so much, and we're used to hiding from other people, we may end up hiding from ourselves and lose a real sense of who we are. So putting a mask on, not always a good thing. Difficult feelings might include things like this after a stroke. It would include upset, questions about why it's happened. It may include anger, feeling that nobody understands, and fear, what if it happens again? Or sadness and a lot of crying. Those sorts of things feelings are natural on a grief type journey, a journey of adjustment. Like I said when I mentioned the mask, suppressing feelings doesn't work. It may be a natural reaction, but in the long run, we have research to show that it simply doesn't work. It often makes things a lot worse, and it consumes a lot of energy, so it can be exhausting. So acknowledging your reality is really important. And I would say it's natural after a stroke to feel maybe some of these: upset, to feel angry, depressed, anxious and frustrated. And you may even be very jealous of others who haven't had a stroke. These sorts of feelings are very natural given the circumstances. And the challenge becomes, can you feel those feelings? Can you allow them as you have them, when you have them, without acting them out on anybody around you, but to just embody them and feel them? So in a way, the practice becomes about allowing feelings, maybe as often as you can, starting in small doses, without judging yourself for them, without avoiding them or pushing them away. And that doing this with time will increase your ability to accept them. Otherwise, what we know is that what we resist tends to persist. So having said all of that about feelings, not being able to choose them, maybe better not to always mask them, and allowing ourselves to have them, I wanted to say a few words about thoughts too. And again, these things are covered in our Action After Stroke course. So suppressing thoughts doesn't work either. Efforts to avoid unwanted thoughts or get rid of them doesn't work. In fact, it does tend to increase their strength and their frequency. So the best thing to do is to just let them be. See if you can identify them as thoughts and let them come and go of their own volition. And I say that in the context that any thought, and particularly negative thoughts, are not necessarily a reality. Post-stroke, you may have had these sorts of thoughts cross your mind. Wondered if it was your fault, if you're responsible, or if you'll ever get better. Maybe you don't feel you deserve all the support and kindness you're getting, if you are getting that from people. You may even feel you're a burden. But the truth is, if these things cross your mind, they are just thoughts. They are not necessarily a reality that everybody can agree on. And it's important to be able to catch our thoughts and know them for what they are. This leads on to coming back to thinking about who we are and who we know ourselves to be, linking back to what I said earlier about self-concept. And it's another little thought experiment I thought I would suggest you do with me. I wonder if you can complete this sentence to describe yourself. Just notice what quickly, first thing maybe, that crosses your mind. So here's the sentence. I am blank. What is it that you noticed your mind filled in? Was your mind rushing with lots of answers there? Or maybe it was a bit shocked by the activity and didn't come up with anything. But I wonder if you're like most people, when you're faced with a question like that, it's probably less likely that you came up with any of these sorts of words, which are rather positive descriptions of somebody. What we know about the mind being super judgmental, cautious and critical is that it's more likely to come up with something critical and judgmental in completing that sentence. And that's a little insight again into what we talk about on our Action After Stroke course, where we look at the antics of the mind, the typical characteristics of my mind and your mind, the things that we have in common. And we learn that it is very critical, it's very judgmental, and it can jump to conclusions and sometimes get things wrong. If we know that about our minds, then maybe we can get a little bit wiser to them and not always be tripped up by what they're telling us. And another part of the course, as I've mentioned before, and something you could consider putting in your toolkit to help you along the way is looking at mindfulness, which is actually a way of being with your experiencing, noticing things like your thoughts, your feelings and sensations, but doing so without judgment. And this is in order to allow everything in short moments to be exactly as it is. And this in turn will build your tolerance to be with things rather than push things away. That can help us when we're in very challenging times. And there's a lot of evidence to demonstrate that mindfulness is generally good for people's well-being, but it can also help with people in pain, people with depression, and so on. So it is something to consider looking into, and or maybe a reason to come on our Action After Stroke course. I wanted to finish today by just looking at a few things commonly known to help people out when they're facing challenges. And the first thing to speak about is about finding meaning and purpose in life. It may be that you are clear about what gave your life meaning and purpose before your stroke, and maybe at the moment some of that has been taken away from you. But maybe underneath it, your core values are unchanged, and the types of things that motivate you, interest you, or provide meaning in your life are still around. So the challenge becomes about how to access those, how to stay on track with creating some sort of meaning for your life in its current state or stages as you journey forward. Another thing that's known to help people on this type of journey is about staying open to change, or being open to change and changing. That is allowing yourself to change as you move along, as you know new things, either about yourself, your abilities and your body, or maybe you come into contact with people who can teach you new things that will be useful to you. And staying open to that will allow you to embrace it if it's there. Third thing that people find generally very helpful is having some sort of resilience to setbacks. And so some people would talk about this in terms of having what would you call it, a growth mindset, being open to know that things that come along are more likely to be setbacks rather than roadblocks. And with time, courage, capacity, and the right questions and support, you might find a way around these setbacks. Or maybe sometimes things just take a bit longer than you're anticipating, and a setback is just about being patient. And the fourth and final thing to know that's very commonly helpful to people with challenges on this type of journey is about having the right support around you. Some people have a very strong, close-knit family that they belong to and find that the support comes from within a family unit. Maybe it's the wider family that helps you out. If it's not directly family, for some people it can be having good friendships that you can fall back on, rely on, and you've got a number of people you could talk to about the challenges you're having or how you feel. And for some people it might come through work-related colleagues and relationships. And maybe it's also about using the best of the knowledge and support you have from any stroke-related professionals who are still involved with you. So those are some very common things that can help people along the way. And I wondered if it was just worth having a final slide asking you what you think you already have in your toolkit. And I use toolkit as a way to describe what we can rely on, the sorts of things we might find useful when we meet challenges and setbacks in life in general. But of course, chances are if you're on this call, you're on a stroke recovery journey, and you might need to enhance that toolkit because you don't have everything that's working for you. So some of the additions you might want to look at in your toolkit is using the best of professional support, physios, OTs, speech and language therapists. Little gems of wisdom and advice you may have had along the way could all form part of your toolkit. As indeed could having family and friends to talk to, colleagues, people that you can trust, and you won't feel so judged by if you opened up to them and risked your mask slipping. What you also might have in your toolkit is some interests or hobbies, whether those are old ones that you can continue at the moment, or if you can't, it's not so easy after the stroke. It might be about finding new ones. Interests and hobbies are known to help people in many different ways, not least of which it can alleviate. There can be tiny moments or small periods where you're not thinking about your stroke. You're actually immersed in something else, and losing yourself in something that's really interesting is known to be helpful to mental health. So finding something to do is very useful. Of course, another thing that's helpful to us all is getting out if you have the capacity to do that, or mobilising at the very least and exercising. Moving the physical body, it's not only good for our physical health, it can build strength and capacity, and of course with a stroke where you've got centres of the brain that have been damaged, it can help build the neuroplasticity back in. So getting out as much as possible, exercising or mobilising might also be something you've got in your toolkit. And the thing I would like to add in for everybody, often because this sort of thing is missing, is something around self-compassion or kindness to yourself. Being with what you're with is probably very, very challenging. And it's at times like this that you might be adding to your burden by having a very critical inner voice. So again, that's something we talk about on Action After Stroke. And if you can get used to what your normal self-talk is and start to slow that down and maybe have some choice and control about changing that, you may be on the journey to find some self-compassion. And that too can be very helpful for people. So that's coming to the end of my brief presentation for today, and I'm going to open up in a short while with some time for questions. I will ask Dawn to add her thoughts after this slide too. But maybe when we're thinking about questions, if you haven't written them in the chat already, you might want to say something about where you are in your recovery and what's helped you most on your journey, because there are others on the call here today that might really learn something from it. Or you might want to say if you've learned something new today, or just had light shine on something in a new way. Or maybe I've said enough to interest you in participating in our Action After Stroke course. Again, that's something you can comment on or put in the chat. And of course, I'm interested if you have any direct questions for me and Dawn generally, perhaps about how counselling could help or how that functions. I'm sure we'd be happy to help you with those too. So for now, I'm going to stop the recording and invite Dawn to add in any of her thoughts before we get to the general questions. Thank you for your time and listening.